Hi, this is Beth from Around the Table Yarns. This is not socks. God, it's been a day. Sweater Club. This is the second meeting of the Sweater Club, and we are working on the Quintessential Cardigan from Churchmouse Yarns and Teas. Because this is a paid pattern, we will not be showing the pattern or discussing specifics of the pattern, but I am going to talk about some techniques for doing the armhole shaping and the shaping of the armholes from the bind offs and the decreases, and then there's some increases, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the neck, the way that they do the bind offs for the neck. The goal is going to be to get, so we hopefully we got the back up to the armholes, and we got the left front, the front that has the button band, not the buttonhole band. I believe that's the left front, up to the armhole. And our goal after today is going to be to finish, especially the button band piece, so the left front piece, so that we can calculate our buttonholes next time. And that will be on March 18th. So, that having been said, I'm going to switch to the camera. So here is our schematic as drawn by me, because I'm a good drawer. And I just want to say that where we're hoping to be is here at the armholes for both the back and the left front. And this is a good time, if you have not already, this is a good time to stop and measure what you're doing. And I say that, I need a pencil with actual lead in it. I say that, so the first thing is to, one, check measurements. And what I really mean is measure across, because the cast on is followed by short rows, and also it's ribbed, so it may draw in a little bit at the cast on edge, but up above the cast on edge before we get to the armholes, this is the widest point of the sweater. And this is a good place to take your tape measure and measure from one end to the other, straight across as accurately as you can, and then take that. So take the actual measurement and divide it by the number of stitches for your size to get an even better gauge. But also you can compare your actual measurement to the pattern. So the pattern has a schematic on last page, I believe. Page 5, 7, 8, page 8. So I'm looking at the schematic on page 8, and each of the sizes at the very bottom, there's a measurement for how far across this is supposed to be. So look at your size and check what measurement it should be, and then measure from here to here on your actual, and do they match? Because it's important to know. So we did this in class this morning, and several people unblocked. So this is not a blocked sweater, but unblocked. A couple of people had measurements that were below what they were expecting, by a little bit under an inch. And there was one person who had a measurement that was 2.5 inches wider than she was expecting it to be. So it's really important to check, because we're still at kind of the beginning of this project. It's really important to check this measurement before you get any further. If it's significant that it's smaller or larger than the size that you want to do, sorry, finish my word, compared to pattern. So you can check the actual gauge, and you can also compare to your pattern what your measurement should be. But if your measurement is off by quite a bit, you may want to rework these pieces to closer to your gauge. And that might mean going up a size or going down a needle size or going up a needle size. And if you have that issue, please let me know and I can help you work through it. The person whose sweater was 2.5 inches wider on the back than she meant it to be is going to redo the back on smaller needles, and check her gauge again. So we calculated what her actual gauge was, and it was 4.7 instead of 5.5, and that was pretty significant. So she's going down a couple of needle sizes. For two people who had a size that was within an inch of the actual size they wanted, they both decided to block to measurements and see if we could make up the difference that way. So within an inch, especially with something that has some positive ease, is potentially work outable with blocking. So that was the decision for a couple of us, and reworking the whole piece was a decision of somebody else. The other thing I want you to do at this point, before we do any decreases, I want you to count your stitches. Sometimes drop stitches can happen, and this is a good place to double check before we do any of this decreasing, because if you will notice at the top of page 3, where the decreases of the armholes for the back are written out, they give you a stitch count. The pattern gives you a stitch count after each step of the armhole shaping. So you want to make sure you have the correct stitch count. Okay, so that's the first thing. When we do the actual steps of the armhole shaping, it's done by doing regular bind offs to start with. So each of the sizes has a number that you are supposed to bind off at the beginning of the next 2 rows. So I did a little demonstration piece here. It's up. I was really hoping this would show up better. I guess that shows up. Okay, so I did a little demonstration piece with about 30 stitches on it, and I want to show you some of the techniques for this step, this part of the sweater shaping. So the first is to just do a regular bind off. So step 1, at the top where it says bind off blank number of stitches at the beginning of the next 2 rows, a normal bind off is working 2 stitches So 2 stitches onto my right needle in pattern. So I'm on the knit side, I'm knitting them, and I pull the first one over the second. So that's bound off 1, 2, I'm going to do 4 for the purposes of demonstration, 3, 4. You have to work 2 stitches before you begin binding off, and I've found that it's really easy to lose count when you're binding off. So to double check your count, hold your needle steady and look and see that the stitch that's still on the needle on the on the right hand needle, that stitch is not bound off. It's right here. Next to it, these two legs are the stitch that is bound off. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I've bound off 4, and that's what I was going to bind off. So then continue to the end of the row, just knitting along. And you do not bind off at the end of the row. You have to turn and bind off at the beginning of the next row, which may seem like some people get confused by that. And the reason that you bind off at the beginning of the next row is because you take your working yarn along with you when you do a bind off, and you don't want to leave your working yarn stranded at the end of the row by binding off in the same direction. So if I got to here and I decided to bind off these 4 stitches, my working yarn would be attached over here, but my next stitch would be back here. So I'd have to cut and reattach my working yarn. So we don't do that. We just work to the end of the row and turn. For the first 2 rows of the bind off, you do it exactly the turn. There's nothing different about it. So I work 2 stitches and then I count out loud when I bind off. 1, 2, 3, 4. Another way you can check, I'm just going to slip this over there so you can see, is you can count the stitches at the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, and here's the one that's not bound off. Okay. So in their pattern, they say slipping the first stitch, bind off blank number of stitches at the beginning of the next blank number of rows. But I want to give you a little tip of something to do that is really makes a much nicer sloped edge to your armhole. So as you finish this purl row, you're coming to the end of the second row of bind off. So you've bound off here, and you're finishing this row. You're going to work all the way to the last stitch and slip the last stitch purlwise. So let me get there. So when I get to the very last stitch, instead of working it, I slip it purlwise and turn my work. That means that the last stitch is not on the same row as the stitch next to it. This is called a bias bind off. So now I'm going to slip that stitch again onto my right needle, and I'm going to slip the stitch next to it where the yarn is attached, the working yarn is attached, onto my right needle, and I'm going to pull the last stitch over the next stitch. So that's 1, and let's say we're going to do 3 on this one. So I'm going to bind off 2 more normally, 2, 3. And what you can see is that because of the last stitch not being worked in that row, it gives a more sloped or smooth line instead of a stair step line. And I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to work to the very end on this other side and do what they're recommending. So they have you work all the way to the end and then slip that first stitch. and then bind off. One, two, three. So I'm just going to slip this onto the other needle to turn it and show you what I'm doing. This seems to me more like a stair step. And over here, it's more like a slope. So this is called the bias bind off. And I learned it from a Coco Knits pattern called Leonie. And what it entails is working to, after the first two rows of a bind off section are worked, if there's following rows of bind off, you work the third and any following rows of bind off to the last stitch and slip it purlwise. So I'm working back over to the last stitch. So in the row before it's bound off, you don't work it. You slip that last stitch. You slip it again with its neighbor to the right needle, both purlwise, and pull it over without having worked either one of them. That's your first bind off, and I'm just going to do one more. There's your second. So it makes this really nice sloped line. And there's not the same kind of stepwise action as you will see if you work that stitch to the end, if you go all the way to the end. So I'm going to do it the way that I'm showing you at the end of this knit row. So I'm going to do the bias bind off at the end of this knit row. So I'm going to bind off 2 stitches at the beginning of my next 2 rows. But before I do that, when I work over there, I slip the last stitch purlwise and turn, slip that stitch and the one next to it without working them, pull the last stitch over the next one, and I'm binding off 2, so I'm going to work one more normally. And then work back. So we're going to call that the end of my bind offs, but you would do this as many times as you needed to do subsequent bind offs after the first 2, after the first 2 rows. So now I've worked all the way over because I'm going to show you decreases. So the difference between them, if you look here, this one looks more stepwise and this one is completely smooth. And the way that that's worked is by not working this in the row before it's bound off, not working the last stitch in the row before it's bound off. And that would be this stitch here. And it makes that nice gentle slope. Okay, so that's the bind offs at the armhole shaping. The next thing, somebody asked me in the class to repeat the decreases, and I also noticed that they do their decreases right at the very edge. So the pattern is written with an SSK on one end and a knit 2 together on the following end of the next right side row, and then repeating that on the right side rows however many times for whichever size you're in. I don't like to do a decrease at the edge because I like to have a clean edge, no shaping between the first and the second stitch and the last and the next to last stitch. So I like my shaping to be in a couple of stitches from the edge. So instead of a row that is, I'm gonna write out the bias bind off in a second, but instead of a decrease row where you have the SSK at the end, and then you work over to the last 2 stitches and do a knit 2 together. I'm going to recommend that you put a knit 2 on either side of that. So that's the 4th thing. The 3rd thing is the bias bind off. And I will write that and put it up for you in just a second. And I will also give you a place to link to the video of them doing it for cocoa knits, because it's a really very clear video. Okay, so if I'm going to do a decrease, and this is where, so we've done the bind off, we've done another bind off, we've done another bind off, but then there's some decreases that happen just inside. So you can see here, there's -1 stitch, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 times, depending on your size, right along that curve. This time I'm going to work the edge stitches, so knit 2. And then for the SSK, we're going to do that kimono sleeve SSK. So by kimono sleeve, I'm talking about the one where you go knitwise into the stitch and slip it off, and then put the left needle tip in the front of that stitch that you slipped, and the right needle tip in the back of the next stitch on the needle, on the left needle. So then you've got both stitches on both needles, wrap around the right needle, which is at the back, and pull it through. And it makes this really smooth looking left leaning decrease. Now I'm going to work to the last 4 stitches on my other side. And I'm going to do a plain old knit 2 together. There's nothing that can be done to make that better. It's a really nice decrease. But you can see that my left leaning decrease over here matches that knit 2 together really well. I'm going to do one with a regular SSK and show you the difference. So I'm just going to purl back. So I'm knitting 2, and then a normal SSK is slip 1 knitwise, slip 1 knitwise, put your left needle in the fronts of both of those stitches and work them together. And then I'll work to the last 4 stitches, knit 2 together, and then knit 2 to the end. So I'm laying that down, and you can see that the knit 2 togethers are just so smooth looking. And the SSK that I just did looks bumpier. You know what? I'm going to purl back so you can see it even more clearly. The SSK that's done in the traditional way looks bumpier to me and to other people. I've always noticed it and thought, wow, those are not the same thing at all. So here is the SSK that I did, the kimono sleeve technique. And it's just so much smoother. And then this is the normal SSK, and it's bumpy. I mean, it almost is texturally completely different from the knit 2 together on the other side. So that's my recommendation for the decreasing that happens. And then you work for a number of rows and you start to increase. So there's some rows that you work, and then there's some pluses. So we have some negatives down here, and we had those bind offs, but then there's a couple of places where you're adding stitches about 16 rows apart. So they're doing it make one right or make one left. So I just want to recommend, this time they do have you knit two. And to make one right, that's, yeah, we can do it. To make one right, you're going to pick it up from behind, and then you want to knit into the front of this stitch. I always find this really hard to get into. And so what I've always recommended is to put your right needle into it purlwise and just pull that stitch forward and put your pointer finger behind. That holds it in place so that you can easily get into it to make one right. And the reason it's make one right is because the strand at the bottom is twisted towards the right-hand side of the work. When we get to 2 stitches before the end, I'm going to put my left needle tip into the front of the stitch, and I'm going to work it in the back with my right needle tip. And I can do that same thing where I pull it out, but it's much easier to get into a make one left. And it's called a make one left again because the twist of the yarn at the base of the new stitch is leaning, the one that's on top is leaning to the left. Purl back. And the next thing that happens in the back, and I think also in the neckline, I could be wrong about the neckline of the front might be a little bit different, but in the back, they have a nice technique for sort of making a really clean edge of the back of the neck. And so I just want to show you this. This is in the middle of page 3 where it says begin neck and shoulder shaping. And they do, so they've had you place markers where the neck is going to be. So we're going to just imagine that these 4 stitches in the middle are where our neck is going to be. So I'm going to work over to, so the marker would be here. I'm going to work over to 1 stitch before the marker. And in the stitch before the marker, so my markers would be here around my 4 stitches in the center. So I'm 1 stitch before the marker, and I'm going to knit into the front and the back of this stitch. And what that does is it creates a new stitch above this. It almost looks like a purl bump. So here's my 1, 2, 3 edge stitches. And now instead of 4 stitches in the center, I have this one and the 4. So I have 5 total. So then you bind off as usual. Until you get to the next marker. So that would look like this. I'd have 1 stitch before the marker and then the marker. They have you remove the marker and bind off 1 more stitch and then work to the end. What it does is it creates this nice, like almost right angled edge to the beginning of that bind off. And it's just a very nice detail in the back of the neck shaping. When you turn to do the back of the neck shaping, if there's more binding off, and there is, they have you purl back and then bind off. Remember that you want to slip that last stitch without working it. You won't just have 3, you'll have more than 3, you'll have like 30 something. But you'll want to work back to the last stitch on the neck edge and slip it without working it for the bias bind off. So hopefully that will help you with the shaping of the back of the sweater and the shaping of the underarm, give you a really lovely curve to the underarm of your sweater. Any questions? So I'm going to do a little asterisk here. So I learned of the bias bind off from Leone, which is a pattern by Coco Knits, which is available for purchase on Ravelry. And I'm going to go to Ravelry and look up Leone. So it's by Julie Weisenberger. And on the website for Leone, here under skills needed, they have the bias bind off. And she shows it really, really nicely in this video. And she shows an example of what the stair-step effect of a regular bind off looks like and what the bias bind off of this technique looks like. So there's a video of how to do it and also a step-by-step of how to do it. So this is under Coco Knits. I will copy that and put it into our comments. I think I spelled your name right. Turn. Do the notes show up on your screens? Do you see notes about this?
I'm looking under notes. I don't see notes. I see all notes. Maybe under shared? Hmm?
Shared meeting.
I don't know.
Is it showing up now?
I see something came up.
Okay.
But it's like it just says around the table yarns personal meeting room. I don't know what that's gonna take me to. Oh, there it is. If you click on it, there's like it says it's the bottom half of it just says bias bind off smoothly from Leone pattern by Julie Weisenberger.
I'm also putting it in the chat and I will put it on the YouTube for this on our website.
Okay.
Because I didn't invent it. And I want to give credit where credit is due. So the goal for next time is to complete the back, if possible, and to complete the, I believe it's the left front, is the button band that we started. Doing these decreases, the technique for doing the shaping of the neck should be pretty straightforward because you'll be doing it from the edge. So you'll be doing it starting at the edge and binding off. And you have that video to look at. And then what I'm hoping to do next time is for us to figure out using this left front where we want to place buttons and calculate the buttons and where the buttonholes are going to be and just cover that. So then you'll on your own do the right front with the buttonholes after that next class. Okay, any questions?
Not yet.
Oh, I have a question about the bias bind off. So for the under where it says back armhole shaping, where they said bind off for my size, it was 6.
Please don't use the details.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Do you always just-
We just don't want to create any proprietary issues.
Okay.
So for your size, you bind off X number of stitches.
Is it always X minus 2 that you do less of to continue on the next 2 rows of bind off?
No, so the first 2 rows of the bind off are normal.
Oh, okay. So you do the number that is
So
for your
you do, so under back armhole shaping, it says bind off blank stitches at the beginning of the next 2 rows.
Okay.
That's done exactly as written.
Okay.
It is after that, if there are further bind offs, so the third and any further bind offs that are connected, you want to slip the last stitch. So in the second row, you would slip the last stitch purlwise.
In the second row.
Yeah, so if we were looking at directions for this, row 1, so this is the bias bind off. Row 1, work exactly as directed. Row 2, work exactly as directed until the last stitch. And you're going to slip last stitch purlwise. Okay.
Okay.
Row 3, slip that last stitch and the next stitch purlwise. So they're on the right needle. So you'd have slipped them both like that. And you're going to pull the first one over the second one. And bind off. And bind off 1 stitch.
Okay.
Okay. And then work 1 stitch and bind off normally. And that's essentially it. For every binding off normally, then continue to last stitch. And if there is a bind off on the next row, you're going to slip that last stitch purlwise.
Okay. So the row before any row with a bind off, you slip.
The row before the third or further rows with the bind off. So row 1, nothing happens.
Right.
Row 2, nothing happens until you slip the last stitch. It's only from row 3 onward.
Okay.
That you would work the bias bind off.
Okay.
And the excellent video of that is on the Leone pattern description, so you don't have to buy the pattern to see the video. You can look at the video. It is a great tool.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
I am going to turn off the recording unless there's any other questions that might help other people. You guys good?
We're good.
Is my recording?
Okay.
All right, we'll be
Thank
back
you.
to do this again on March 18th.